Good morning. The hearing board for the South Coast Air Quality Management District is in session. Today is Thursday, April 5th, 2018. The time is 9:30 a.m. We are meeting in the hearing board room in Diamond Bar. We have one matter on the agenda for today, and that is Bison California Malberg LLC, case number 5727-4, for a short variance. And who is representing Bison California Malberg this morning?
Good morning, board members. My name is Scott Galati. I'll be representing Bison. I'll call him just Bison for now. And with me, I have three potential witnesses, one definitely that will testify today, and that is Kyle McCormick, who is the environmental manager for Bison. I also have the plant manager, Matt Richards, who's here to answer questions that the board might have. He's the plant manager of the Malberg Generating Station. And also I have with me Mr. Gregory Darvin, who is with Atmospheric Dynamics, who is the consultant who helped us calculate the excess emissions.
Thank you. And Mr. Galati, would you mind for the record, for the clerk, please spelling your name?
Yes, it's Galati.
Thank you very much. And who is representing the executive officer this morning?
Sherry Hanizavara on behalf of the executive officer.
Thank you, Ms. Hanizavara. Before we begin, a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to ask everyone who may or will serve as a witness today to please rise to be sworn in. Please raise your right hand. Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Also, we have received proposed variance conditions, and I'd like to mark them as an exhibit. So was this submitted by Bison or by the executive officer?
These are submitted on behalf of the executive officer, but they've been agreed to by petitioner.
Thank you. So we're going to mark them as Exhibit A for the executive officer and put those aside. And then the final thing is there was a request, before we start with openings, there was a request by one board member as to whether you have a schematic available as to the equipment at an issue today.
I'm sorry, I don't have that with me.
Okay.
We can do our best to describe what that looks like because we do have the plant manager and the environmental manager here.
Okay, and if need be, perhaps we can have whomever kind of walk us through it on the white chalkboard.
Okay.
Or whatever we call that. Okay. Okay, so Mr. Galati, if you can give us your opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate the board hearing this matter so quickly for us. Bison operates the Malberg Generating Station. The Malberg Generating Station is a combined cycle power plant that is essential here in Southern California and especially in and around the city of Vernon in providing efficient and natural gas-fired clean electricity to the California transmission grid. We'll be using a term called the California ISO, or the Independent System Operator. That's the group that actually runs the transmission system and dispatches the plant on when electricity needs to be provided and sent to the electric transmission grid. I'm going to go through what you're going to hear early in our testimony and give you a summary about why we believe the board can make the 6 findings that are necessary for this short-term variance. The activities that we're going to be engaging in is to upgrade a control system. The control system consists of software and some electrical components, and this control system is actually what is used to operate the machinery. It actually turns the turbines on, it ramps them up, ramps them down, it communicates with California Independent System Operator. It is the brains of how the facility will generate electricity. The system that we have is growing obsolete. It's becoming difficult to be able to get people to repair it, and we want to upgrade it. The facility right now is in a scheduled outage, so it is not operating. These facilities schedule their outages so that the independent system operator knows that they can't rely on this facility to generate electricity at this time. So the facility is not operating, and what we'd like to do is upgrade the control system, and when we do that, we need to run some very specific tests. with Siemens, the manufacturer, to ensure that the system communicates to the machinery and actually makes it operate in a way that is intended to operate. The system has to comply, or I should say, the facility has to demonstrate that it can comply with different loading conditions and that the control system will operate the machinery as intended in order to satisfy several agencies' requirements. The primary one would be the independent system operator, who ensures that the project will be able to generate electricity and connect to the interconnection, the grid, and operate in a safe and reliable manner. So there's a series of tests that are prescribed that we need to run the control system through to prove, number one, that the facility can be relied upon, and two, we believe that the upgrade to this control system would further enhance our ability to stay within our emission limits for our permit. So that's what we're asking for today, is the ability to run these tests during this outage and upgrade that part of the system. With respect to the first finding, the facility will not be able to comply with 6 conditions. The first 3 conditions in our permit are A99.3, which deals with emissions of NOx, A99.4, which deals with emissions of CO, and A99.5, which deals with VOC emissions. This permit condition actually tells us what our emission limits and the number of times and the amount of time that we can be in a startup mode or a shutdown mode. And the startup and shutdown modes are modes in which the pollution control equipment is not 100% operable and efficient at that time. So we have emission limits. We're asking for some increase to those emissions per event, and that is why we're not going to be able to comply with those conditions. In addition, there is a limit of the number of starts and stops that we can make in a month. And by doing this testing, we might have to start more often and then shut back down and then bring the machine back up to make sure the system works. We're going to have more starts and stops in the month than we're allowed by this condition. It also has a daily start and stop limit, and we'll not likely comply with that daily start and stop limit. The 3 other conditions that we're not going to be able to comply with is condition A195.1, 195.2, and 195.3. These conditions set concentration limits for NOx, CO, and VOC during normal operations. When we are up and operating full load, the emission system will be able to meet these requirements. But in order to test the control system, we're going to have to operate at low load scenarios, which are not covered by our permit nor anticipated that we would be able to operate at these low loads. And it's those low loads where we may not be able to meet these emission limits. So those are the conditions that we're asking to be, for the variance to allow us to not be in compliance with. We've agreed with district staff on variance conditions that will limit emissions during these time frames. We just can't meet the ones that are in the permit. Finding 2, this, if the variance weren't granted, it would basically be an unreasonable taking of property. It would be a practical closing or elimination of a lawful business in the following manner. I think of this in 2 steps. If you are not able to grant our variance today, we would be coming to you in the future asking for the exact same variance because this control system is becoming obsolete and we're trying to prevent the possibility of a breakdown in the future. So that is something that we'd like you to consider. Second of all, we have actually scheduled this during a time when we're already not operating. And we have designed our system in a way, our protocol in a way such that our normal monthly emission limits, which we're allowed to operate within, this commissioning activity during the month of April will still be below those monthly emission limits. If we were unable to upgrade this control system and suffer a breakdown during a time when it's not a scheduled outage, you'll hear Mr. McCormick testify as to the significant financial burden that would be placed on the project, who has contractual obligations to deliver power when called. If ultimately the variance were never granted, now or in the future, even under another variance, it would eliminate our ability to interconnect to the system, and we would not be able to transmit electricity because CalISO would not allow us to, because we haven't made the demonstration that our control system functions properly, and we would have to close down the plant, and Mr. McCormick will talk about what the effect would be of that. We believe that with respect to finding 3, that the closing or taking would be without a corresponding benefit in reducing air contaminants. And the reason that we believe that is we do believe that we're going to have to do this upgrade. These emissions are going to be the same whether we do them during this outage or we do them some other time. Otherwise, the facility won't be able to operate. In addition, we believe that upgrading this control system is going to provide us with software that works more efficiently, continuing our good record in being able to comply with the emission limits that we currently have in the permit. So we think there is a corresponding benefit to actually granting the variance because it's upgrading the system. Finding 4, we have considered curtailing. This is a system that needs to be fixed, and unlike a variance where we have something broken and we would not operate the facility and then fix it, those are the times when you ask, oftentimes, has the applicant or the petitioner considered curtailing? We are curtailing. We are in an outage right now. We're not emitting, and we're not operating, and we'd like to do that upgrade during this scheduled outage. In addition, you'll hear Mr. McCormick talk about how we have worked with Siemens, is the manufacturer of the turbines. They're the ones that's going to be performing this testing with us, and we've worked with them to condense the testing into as few steps as possible so that we can reduce emissions during this time. Finding 5 asks about whether or not we are reducing the excess emissions to the maximum extent feasible. What we've done with Siemens is to take different steps, put them together so that we don't increase emissions, and actually run the machine for each and every step. We've done that to the extent possible. However, we have overestimated our excess emissions in our in our variance application, because this is a commissioning activity. Sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes the machine will trip and you have to restart it. We've taken all of that into consideration, and the emission estimates that you see in our petitions is an emission estimate that is the worst case scenario, but we're committed to report our emissions to the district, and we're working very hard to reduce them. And if everything goes perfectly, our emissions will be very low, and if everything goes as planned, they'll be less than what we've anticipated and told you about. If there are problems, we've already counted for them in our excess emissions. One other thing I'd like to point out with respect to that finding is when a power plant does get a license and a permit to operate from the district and an authority to construct, and it does begin, it usually has a set of commissioning emission conditions for bringing the facility up the first time. During this project, we had a set of commissioning conditions, and we were required to offset for those commissioning emissions, which we did in some one-time offsets for even CO, which was in non-attainment at that time. So we believe we'll be mitigating our emissions. We'll continue to track them, and we're part of the NOx reclaim program, and they'll be accounted for that way as well. Finding 6 asks if we're going to monitor, and we are. There's some proposed conditions that we agree with the district staff in front of you that show that their SEMs will be operating, will be reporting, and will be calculating and working with the district, including preparation of final reports and during these commissioning activities. So we will be reporting what our emissions are with district staff. So that's my opening statement, and you'll hear the same from Mr. McCormick, but with more detail, should you so desire.
Thank you, Mr. Galati. Ms. Henny Zavra, your opening.
Good morning, Chairman Prusak and members of the board. The district and Bison have come to an agreement on the proposed conditions, which you should have before you. And we've also come to an agreement on the calculation for the excess emissions, which I believe you should have before you too in an exhibit that petitioner gave. So subject to the proposed conditions and the evidence and the testimony that's presented here today, the district does not oppose the request for the short variance.
Thank you. Mr. Galati, if you can introduce your first witness, and please make sure that you have the witness state their name, spell their name, and indicate for the record that they have taken the oath today.
Okay. Well, thank you. Madam Chair, should I introduce exhibit number 1 at this point?
Yes, if you have an exhibit, this would be a good time to introduce that.
Yes, and while that's being passed out, I'll explain the exhibit. The variance conditions require compliance with the emissions that are listed on this exhibit. So the variance conditions refer to this exhibit.
Okay, so we have received a one-page exhibit which has at the top Table 1 Malberg Commissioning Schedule, and we will mark that as exhibit number 1 for petitioner.
Thank you. So at this time, I'd like to call Mr. McCormick. And Mr. McCormick, could you please state your full name, spell your last name, your title, and your address for the record, please, and that you have taken the oath.
Hello, my name is Kyle McCormack. That's KYLEMCCORMACK. I'm an environmental manager for Herat Power Management, and I have taken the oath. Herat Power Management. H-E-O-R-O-T.
And Mr. McCormick, could you explain the relationship between Herat Management and Bison California Malberg LLC?
That's correct. Herat Power Management is the operator and owner as a parent company for Bison California Malberg.
Mr. McCormack, did you hear my opening statement about which conditions we can't comply with?
I did.
Could you just briefly tell the board why we can't comply with the condition? Please name the condition.
Okay. Conditions A99.3, A99.4, and A99.5 are all related to mass emissions and startup scenarios for mass emissions. They spell out how long we can operate in a low load scenario while we're ramping the turbines up to be at an operating load. The turbines, when we're going through a startup and we're warming the turbines up, warming the steam turbine up, emit at a higher rate than they do when we're at our normal operating load. Just as part of combustion, they're tuned in a way so that they're optimized when we're at the normal load and normal operating range. So they're not very efficient when we're operating at this lower range. The testing that we have to do, unfortunately, requires us to park at these lower operating ranges where we don't typically operate. Additionally, there are some start durations and time durations that we may have to exceed. Trying to minimize those as much as possible, but if we have to stay at a low load scenario for over an hour and a half, for example, is one of the conditions, or if we have to emit at a higher rate for duration of that time, then we would like relief from that for this very brief testing period.
And Mr. McCormack, could you please describe the testing protocol and how the testing protocol was determined for purposes of this commissioning activity?
Yes, we worked hand in hand with Siemens, who does all the testing and specifications. Initially, they provided us with a testing schedule that was much more extensive than what we've asked for in return. We've pushed back on them in a manner so that they understand that we really need to mitigate emissions. We can't just have a unqualified testing schedule where we let them do whatever. So we've gone back and forth quite a number of times to reduce the number of tests they do, as well as combining several of the tests during like one start, for example, so that we can do 2 or 3 separate tests concurrently and reduce steps, reduce emissions in the long term, and reduce the amount of startups, which is where the majority of our excess emissions, our higher emissions, will occur.
And could you briefly describe the objective of demonstrating that the project is safe and reliable for purposes of the independent system operator?
Yes, so the CalISO, the independent system operator, handles the balancing of electricity and offtake of electricity from us to the end user, the consumer. And for us to be able to operate on that system, we need to meet the sets of safety standards requirements. There is some risk when you're bringing a power plant up and connecting to a grid, where if mistakes happen, it can cause catastrophic failure. It can cause the whole city to go down and lose power, not just the plant to not meet the grid. So they have requirements that we're obligated to meet to protect the safety of the whole system.
And could you briefly describe what does this control system do within the plant?
Control system is essentially the brains of the plant. It controls all the equipment, all the voltage, all the relays, all the controls pumps, switches, everything in the plant that requires an electronic control is controlled by this system.
And the current control system, is that obsolete?
Yeah, currently the control system is obsolete. It was relatively old when we installed it, unfortunately. That was through another company that owned the plant at the time. It is incredibly difficult for us right now to get some of the physical hardware has been obsolete, and it's just not available except through third-party or refurbished sites. As well as I believe Siemens only has one person that's able to work inside this system now currently, and so emergency repairs or things are really difficult for us to respond to.
And do you believe that when the control system is upgraded, the facility will have additional benefits beyond just meeting the safety and reliability standards?
There are, along with the upgraded software components and physical components, it will allow for our system to be more responsive with our emission controls, particularly the ammonia system. Currently, our system has trouble chasing emissions, and so we have to ramp up and ramp down at a slower rate so that we can make sure that the system doesn't have an excess emissions. And the new system will be more responsive and quicker to operate with that.
Okay, and could you please describe what would be the economic impact if the variance weren't granted? Let's take this in 2 steps. If the variance weren't granted during this outage.
Okay. If it weren't during this outage, we're contractually obligated to come back online after the outage. If we don't meet the safety standards and the testing standards for the ISO, we will not be able to connect back to the grid. We have contractual obligations with our off-taker, roughly to the tune of $125,000 a day that we would not be able to meet. We're right about $3.75 million a month.
And what would be the economic impact if the variance were postponed and, let's say, done a month or 2 from now, not during the outage?
Well, really, every day we would be subject to the loss of revenue from that, as well as additional fees going forward. It would also put us in breach of contract with our off-taker after 30 days, which would present other legal and additional challenges.
And if the variance weren't, or this upgrade wasn't done, would the plant ultimately have to be taken out of service?
Yeah, ultimately, yeah, we would not be able to sustain losses like that long term.
And could you briefly describe for the board what happens if the Cal ISO is depending on the Malberg generating station to operate and it can't operate? Does it dispatch other facilities?
Yeah, so the independent system operator has a base load that they're required to meet, and they schedule for. So they schedule power plants based on a number of factors, including heat rate, efficiency, things of those nature. Because we're a combined cycle natural gas facility, we are more efficient than some of the simple cycle facilities in the area. We recapture some of the heat to create electricity with a steam turbine from the exhaust path. So we're able to reuse some of the excess heat to generate more electricity. So it makes us a more efficient facility. If we don't operate, the ISO will have to replace that power from somebody else. They'll dispatch somebody invariably down the totem pole. They always start at the most efficient and go down. And so the lower they go, the less efficient the power is going to be.
So they couldn't just dispatch a renewable energy project, for example?
Renewable energy, while it is, a track to meet standards, 30% reliability standard in 2020, 50% in 2030, I believe. They're not quite there yet. And regardless, when renewables are there now, there still are peaks and valleys when the sun's not shining or when the wind's not blowing. And you need spinning reserve right now is how they make up for the sometimes sudden impact of those. And so usually we stay running at a base load, and we have a capacity of another 40 or 50 megawatts that we can ramp up to almost immediately to provide balancing for when those peaks and valleys happen. And so if we were to take that out of consideration, it would put additional strain on them to manage that particular resource.
And could you just briefly explain, you used a term called spinning reserve. Could you please briefly explain that to the board?
Yeah, spinning reserve is is an amount of electricity that our capacity that we have that we can provide almost instantly, which helps manage those peaks and offsets from like wind and sun. So basically, spinning reserve is the difference between your normal operating load and your maximum load. So we have that available at any time that the ISO needs it.
Okay, and Mr. McCormack, did Bison give consideration to curtailing operations in source of, in lieu of asking for this variance?
Yes, we have. We both have managed this so that it falls within a major outage during which we know that we're going to be offline. We've actually been offline since the start of March, so we have 2 months where we're not emitting. So that takes a big chunk, and really for the combined 2 months, I think we're emitting quite a bit less. Additionally, we've been working with Siemens, as recently as last week even, to try to minimize the amount of testing to whatever extent we possibly can, that we're going to operate in those alternate scenarios where we aren't as efficient.
Is it true that the excess emissions that you've estimated are based on a worst case scenario during the commissioning?
Yes, it is. The last thing we want to do is come back and ask again, so we have to build some contingency in. It is a commissioning process. We're replacing components and parts, so you expect some failure to happen. We're trying to accommodate for some of that failure, and we think we've managed to come up with a worst case scenario that even with some failures that we are able to meet.
And Mr. McCormack, did you review the proposed variance conditions?
I did.
And do you agree to comply with those?
Yes, I agree that we can and will comply with those.
Madam Chair, I don't have anything else from this witness unless the board is particularly interested in something here. I also have the plant manager and also have our environmental consultant should you have any questions about how the excess emissions were calculated.
Thank you. So what we'll do is we'll ask Ms. Sunny Zavra if she has any questions for the district, and then the board will likely ask questions as well, and then we can move on to the next witness.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Sunny Zavra?
So, Mr. McCormick, you mentioned that Siemens had initially given you an extensive schedule and that it had been simplified. Can you explain, for the benefit of the district and the board, what the simplified schedule will look like? For
The simplified schedule is the one that we've presented. So the original.
And the board has a copy.
Yeah, it's, if I may, it's Table 1 in Exhibit 1.
And when we're referring to exhibits, it's exhibits to the actual petition itself, as opposed to any exhibits I might mark today. Correct?
No,
I'm sorry.
I'm actually referring to the exhibit that we gave you today, because there's been some refinement since the petition for variance.
My apology. Thank you. We're referring to the Exhibit 1 we just marked today.
Okay.
If you can sort of go through Table 1, maybe, and explain what the process will look like for the testing, you know, as simply as you can, or
That's enough for Matt.
whatever makes sense. Sort of summarize the table.
Yeah, why don't I defer to Matt on this one? He's a little more familiar with the technicals and able to communicate that probably better than I would be able to as the plant manager.
Anything that, that you cannot answer, we will defer until that witness is testifying. And it's a perfectly good answer to say, I do not know the answer.
Then that's all I have for this particular witness right now.
Board members, Mr. Camarena and then Ms. Byrd, sorry.
Let's see if I understand. The change to the new system, the new controls, was initiated by you, but the testing is a requirement of CalISO to make sure that it's going to work as CalISO needs. Is that
That's correct.
generally?
Yeah.
And so you scheduled this work for during the current outage.
That's correct.
What other reasons do you have for the outage?
There's a multitude of reasons. We're on a maintenance cycle, so we have routine, typical maintenance that we do on an annual and our semi-annual basis. And this happened to fall on a major maintenance cycle. We wanted to apply it during the major maintenance cycle in part to help offset some of the emissions.
You described in your testimony some of the problems that you encounter with the current system. Could you elaborate on some of them? Have any of, well, I'll stop there.
Okay. The majority of the difficulty that we have now with the existing system is an obsolescence of parts. So it's difficult when a component, a PLC component, a relay component fails and we need to replace it. Since the manufacturer, some of those components have obsoleted, they're just not available. And so we have to find refurbished ones or find them in other places. Additionally, the computers that some of the stations work on are an old vintage, again, where parts just aren't available. And so we need to go through a process of, you know, finding and restoring physical components to these old computers.
Has it resulted in a failure to ramp up on demand by CalISO or some other reason?
Has not yet resulted in a failure. We have an availability contract, so we try to preempt failure as much as effectively as we can and run it in a preventative manner.
And some of the testing that you'll be doing will be at low load, and this is not typical, or do you never operate at those loads?
For some of the tests, the early tests, we never operate at those loads. There will be full speed no load, for example, where we're at full speed on the turbine, but not offset on load, and that's not a normal operating routine in any manner.
And that's a CalISO requirement that you test at that load?
Yes, that sure is.
And that's when you exceed emission limits?
That will be our highest emission limits, that's correct. I don't know that we'll exceed necessarily, just kind of depends how it goes, but more than likely we will.
Thank you.
Part of what Mr. Camarino was asking was something that I was trying to clear up, and that was, I thought I heard it said that the emissions would be less than if operating. Did I hear that, or did I misunderstand that?
Mass emissions.
Mass emissions,
So
okay.
we emit throughout the month. Typically, we're on a base load, and we typically are running 24/7.
Okay.
So the cumulative emissions throughout the month are going to be less than
Okay,
typical.
okay,
Or most likely will be less than typical, but will be less than our permitted limits.
okay. And I didn't have a lot of time to look through the conditions, but I see days within which the turbines will be running for the commissioning. In your petition, you had initially asked for April 1st to start through April 30th. Are you asking for 16, I see it's no more than 16 days. Are you asking for consecutive days? Are you asking for?
No, just days in general. There may be days where we skip.
So 16 days
Or we
within,
have a lockout or something. So yeah, 16 days within that.
within starting now until the 30th of April?
That's correct.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I had that question, and so you feel comfortable that you'll be completed with those 16 days by the end of this month?
Yes, we sure do.
Okay. I wondered if you could just walk us through what's some of the rules that you're requesting a variance from, so we can understand precisely what portions, and in particular, if we could let's start with the NOx rule A99.3.
Okay, 899.3.
And let me ask you, so do you anticipate cold and non-cold startups?
Yes, we will have both.
Okay. Do you expect any cold startups to exceed 120 minutes or 150 minutes with trips?
No, I don't expect a cold startup to run past. There may be a warm start that does. Again, we did build in some contingency for testing failures and things like that. So while it's not expected, we did try to plan for that somewhat.
I'm just trying to walk through the requirements of the rule so we know what precisely you're looking for the variance from, so we can assess from there. So you're not anticipating or asking for a variance from the cold startup duration of 100, each one of 120 or 150 regarding ones that don't trip or do trip. That would be in paragraph,
Yeah,
essentially paragraph, I don't know if it's, I guess it's 3, but it's on the second page of that rule, on page 14 of that condition, I should say, not rule.
and yeah, I think I think we'd still like to have that again, more as a contingency measure.
Okay. So it may occur, but you're not sure. Okay.
Right. We don't expect a lot of some of these. Some of them we do expect, but we need to have a plan in place in case we come across a problem with testing equipment or somewhere, and we need to stay there just a little bit longer while they redo something or.
Okay. And then there are limits for each startup in terms of not to exceed total pounds of NOx, and it's the same for VOC and it's the same for CO in the other rules as well. They mirror them, although there are different amounts. Do you anticipate exceeding those limits that are in the rule?
Yes, the pounds per start limits, we do expect to exceed those on a short-term mass emission basis. When we are operating in those, like a full-speed node load scenario, we will have a higher concentration for a longer duration time, where typically our control equipment comes in at some point. Once we get up on load, that's not going to happen in these scenarios.
Okay, so that is, those low-speed scenarios, that's anticipated as part of the startups?
That's correct.
And then I'm wondering, I know you mentioned briefly, but you expect to exceed 10 startups in the month of April?
Yeah, even with our testing schedule the way it is right now, we'll be right up on it. If we have a trip, which is almost a certainty when you're doing any kind of commissioning activity, then it will put us in excess of the 10 for the month. We still think we'll be able to meet our annual total, but the monthly one will be very difficult for us.
Okay, and then similarly, you anticipate you may need more than 2 startups a day in any one given day?
Agreed, yes, for the same reason.
Okay. Can you compare, I'm looking at the conditions that are proposed for the variance. And in particular, I'm looking at the total runtime hours in 4 and 5. Do you have any idea? Because I did notice that there's no limit proposed, and I did look at these quickly, and maybe I'm missing it, but I see that there's a whole back. I sat down and saw this and haven't had a time to review. Is there any proposed condition that would limit the number of startups and shutdowns?
I don't believe so. I think
Okay.
where we went was we calculated the total amount of missions that we would need, figured out the amount of time that it would take to meet all of those testing, plus some contingency, and capped it that manner by limiting the hours and the amount of time that we're allowed to operate in those scenarios.
Right, so can you tell us a ballpark or some estimate of how many more how much more are you going over these rules in terms of how many startups you're anticipating when you have the limits set in the proposed variance conditions as they are set in 4 and 5 as to 56.25 hours per each turbine and 112.5 hours total?
That, I'll defer to Greg on that
Okay.
number. We have some calculations we've gone into, and he can elaborate more on the specific amount of starts and all that he's accounted for in that.
Okay, so I will hold my question for that. Thank you.
Madam Chair, can I provide some clarification there?
Yes.
The way the conditions work is they refer to Table 1 and Table 2, and Table 1 is a schedule, and the conditions require us to operate within that schedule.
Okay, then I'll try to review those before we have that witness on and try to compare those. Thank you, that's very helpful. I have no other questions for this witness. Anyone else have questions for Mr. McCormick? Okay, oh, Senator does.
In your petition, attachment 2 pretty much clarifies what you need for the it's called short-term variance petition. You explain everything there. If you can walk down there, I think it might be quite clarifying, explicit.
For Table 2?
Attachment 2.
Oh, attachment 2.
It's all the things we can't comply with.
Okay, so you want me to be
walk through
specific
that.
about which ones that we cannot comply with and how?
It's all of them.
Can you walk through that?
Sure. Number one, a definition of the conclusion of a startup. Right now, in our permit, the conclusion of a startup is defined as a 15-minute quadrant when we are backed compliant. And for some of these activities that we intend to do, we're not going to meet our backed requirement during the startup time. And so we're still considering a startup, we're still calculating the emissions, but we just wanted to clarify on that little piece where we're defining what that startup really is. Number two, 120-minute time limit for cold starts without a trip, 150-minute time limit for cold startups with a trip. Again, there's some contingency there when we do some of this testing. Right now, we're limited to keeping our emissions below certain levels in that time. We're certainly going to exceed the emissions levels, as I stated before. There's also the chance that if there's problems with the testing, that will exceed some of those time limits as well. It's not anticipated, but it's a contingency that we put in to account for worst case scenarios, since this is a commissioning activity. Number three, a 90-minute time limit for non-cold startup without a trip, and 120-minute time limit for a non-cold start with a trip. It's the same thing. Trip or cold start versus non-cold start is defined as cold start is when the turbine has not been operating for 48 hours or greater, and a non-cold start is anything under 48 hours.
Explain a trip.
Trip is uncontrolled shutdown of the turbine for whatever reason. If there's a number of engineering and safety pieces that are run in the background. So if anything goes wrong during the process of starting the turbines, it'll trip the unit, shut the unit down so that it doesn't damage the unit.
Do you observe a lot of trips during this operation?
Not during normal operation. Since we're doing commissioning, we are replacing physical components. There's increased chance of trip. It's just a lot of work being done, so you know that
Carry
happens.
on, okay, go ahead next.
So limit of 10 startups per, oh, sorry, I apologize, 30-minute time limit for shutdown. The shutdown is defined as a controlled termination of the unit, so that you're opening a breaker and terminating flame on the unit. And we're limited to 30 minutes on that. Again, we don't anticipate being over on that particular one, but as a contingency, if something fails because the control system upgrade, we want to have a little flexibility there as well. Typically, it takes 2 or 3 minutes to shut down. It's really not a complicated process. It can stall sometimes in areas for safety reasons, so we just need to be extra sure. Limited 10 startups per month. Again, we're going to be right on that if everything goes perfect. Because we're doing a commissioning activity, I don't expect that. I certainly can't plan for that. So we're asking for more than 10 startups for the month. Limit of 5 cold startups per month. Same thing. If the turbine trips in certain manner, sometimes we're put on a 48-hour lockout of the turbine where we can't even attempt to restart it. And that puts us into another cold start. If that happens 5 consecutive times, we'd be over on that because of problems. I don't anticipate that, but again, it's a contingency.
That lock, is that automatic?
Yeah.
The system shuts down automatically, is what you're saying?
Yeah, it sure does. It gets puts itself on turning gear to keep
Okay,
the shaft, and
carry
it
on.
just
Okay, go ahead.
we're not able to do anything to it for 48 hours.
We withdrew that last one, the next one,
Okay, limit at 2 startups per day. Is that the one you're talking about?
56, make sure.
Oh, okay, yeah, limited 2 startups per day. That one I do anticipate us exceeding. Again, if we have a trip and have to restart a couple hours later, that's very feasible and very possible, even with a commissioning activity like this, where sometimes it takes a couple attempts to get it started up done with repairs and stuff in between.
But it's no more than 2 a day.
Well, that's what we're limited to right now. We're asking relief from that for this duration.
You want more?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So that one, we got on, so.
Tell them that we've, yeah.
Number 8 is a limit of 56 startups per year. Because we requested this variance in a shorter time frame, we've withdrawn that particular line item. We do feel like we can meet our yearly startup limits, and it wouldn't be applicable to this variance. Number 9, limit of 30 cold startups per year. Same thing as number 8. Number 10 is cold startup NOx emission limits of 122.8 pounds. Really, the next handful that all go into pounds limits are all going to be the same thing. When we're running in these low speed or full speed no load scenarios, we're going to emit more than those most likely, and it really is just about having a high concentration over an extended amount of time while we're doing this testing. Furthermore, going down to conditions A195.1, 2, and 3, where we have the 2 ppm NOx emission limit, 2 ppm CO emission limit, and 2 ppm VOC emission limit all corrected. Those we will be exceeding during these full speed no load scenarios. That the concentrations will be higher for those times. And that should be all of them.
So your exhibit petition 1 is asking for to deviate from what's in attachment 2, is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. McCormack? Seeing none. Mr. Galati, your next witness.
At this time, I'd like to call Matt Richards to answer council's question.
Can you introduce Mr. Galati? Can you introduce Mr. Richards? Have him spell his name, his title, and whether he took the oath today. And if you can just briefly state what he would be able to testify to.
Yes. Mr. Richards, could you please state your name?
Good morning, guys. Matt Richards, Matt Richards, plant manager for the station. That's MATTRICHARDS. And yes, I've taken the oath.
I apologize, Chair. I can't remember your exact question, so I defer that. Council.
So the,
I'm sorry, wait, can I just interrupt you for one moment? Can you just tell us, Mr. Richards is able to testify to what in particular? Which of the findings or information that we haven't covered?
Yeah, I brought Mr. Richards to be able to testify to any questions on how the plant operates. And so with respect to the need, I believe that in finding two and maybe finding one on noncompliance, Mr. Richards, I think, can testify to those findings.
Thank you, that will be very helpful. Ms. Honeyzavra.
good morning, Mr. Richards. So I'm looking at the exhibit that petitioner submitted, and I regret that I forget what it was numbered, but petitioner's exhibit A, I believe, or exhibit 1, which would be tables 1 and 2. So I'm looking at the schedule, days 1 through 8, and I was wondering if, for the benefit of the district and the board, if perhaps you could walk us through what the commissioning schedule is going to look like.
Right, so you see the listed activities, and these mostly relate to, as Kyle mentioned, the ISO requirements for the generator protection. So for the tuning of the frequency, this all relates to how the generator synchronizes with the grid and the safety protections we have to maintain and commission to achieve that. There's a variety of parameters the generator has to output to match the grid safely and reliably. Those include frequency, which is the speed of the unit, the voltage, which is how many volts the generator is exerting on the grid. There's also multiple other protections that protect our generator from any disturbances from the grid that could damage our power plant. So due to that, much of this tuning is required, as Kyle had mentioned, at full speed, no load they call, which is basically at synchronizing speed, the same speed that the turbine is operating at, the grid matches that speed, but you do a bunch of function tests and electrical tests to make sure that your electrical frequencies match the grid's frequencies. So when they come together as one, that it's safe and that no damage can possibly be caused. You guys might recall 2003, the great blackout in the East Coast. Was one plant in Cleveland tripped offline and cascaded to 100 other power plants, and 55 million users lost electricity in that incident. So it's due to reasons like that that these rules exist for these maintenance practices, and we have to have proof that we not only adhere to these, but illustrate we have test records for these tests to show that our equipment is safe to operate on this system. So I can go into technical details if you'd like to hear those, but most of these stator earth protection, sync to dead net, over voltage protection, these are all parameters within our digital relays that you have to prove function properly as a protection means for the unit. So up to day 7, typically, what each start allows you to do is run the unit to full speed. While it's coming to speed, it illustrates the frequency can be matched, illustrates the voltage can be matched. Allows the engineers to really see that the control system is capable of automatically, without human intervention, is capable of automatically fine-tuning these parameters before the unit comes online for safety. So the goal is to have zero human intervention and have the engineered controls take care of all the safeguards. And it requires tuning specifically to do that. I hope that helps.
That's all I have for now.
Board members, any question for Mr. Richards? Mr. Richards, would you be the witness to try and explain, based on the total time that that you anticipate that you'll be running these turbines during the commissioning, how that relates to the rules that limit startup and shutdown time in terms of, for example, if I were to look at the total time hours that you have on Exhibit 1 under Table 1 and do crude division, et cetera, it looks like you may be anticipating you may more than double the amount of startups that are allowable under the rules. Is that, would you be able to give us some rough estimate of what should be expected?
Yeah, the estimations you see, the hours next to each activity, are the estimation that the engineer has provided as to the time he needs to perform each of those individual steps on that day. And that mostly consists of him with his diagnostic equipment actually performing those tuning steps, especially down when you start seeing, specifically on day 7, you see the quarter hour steps. That's the anticipated at each load. He needs a quarter hour to do the emissions tuning at that step before he proceeds to the next step. So he has a checklist he runs through with known times based on their experience and based on their best practices of what they're able to achieve, which, as Kyle mentioned also, were narrowed down significantly from their original proposed tuning steps. So we've really pushed on the OEM to give us the most possible condensed version of these tuning steps that they can do to come up with these hours, which is the best case scenario. The reason for the additional steps, as you asked, was due to the fact that, yes, stuff does not always go according to plan perfectly, especially with a condensed plan like we have. If there's any difficulties in any one of these steps, where the engineer has a problem with the transmitter, has a problem with his equipment, has a problem with really anything, it's going to delay that particular step, which in turn accumulates additional hours and possibly additional starts.
And you are not the witness to walk us through excess emission calculations?
Correct. That
Okay.
would be Gregory.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Richards? Senator.
And your Exhibit 1, so that I can understand what's going on here.
Sure.
You have SU startup and the SD shutdown.
Correct.
Okay, and so in the day 1, you just have startup routine hours 0.
Yes, that's just a preparation day, which
I
we did.
understand. And then day 2, you're tuning the frequency.
Correct. Which is the speed of the gas turbine specifically.
That's per engine,
Excuse me?
per turbine.
Correct.
They're doing it simultaneously.
No, they will be doing them separately. Each one requires a special team to be analyzing the
So if I
data.
were to have one chart for one and one chart for the other, but this applies to both. If I had one
Yes.
exhibit for one.
Correct.
You should do one and then do 2. I'm going to have to dig it out of you. Then on day 2, same thing, sort of. Day 3, what is that AVR average?
Auxiliary voltage regulator, or automatic voltage regulator. That's what actually controls the voltage at the generator through the exciter.
And you run that for about 4 hours?
Correct. It's a very advanced piece of hardware. Specifically, this piece of hardware dictates how much energy the generator produces by providing power to the exciter.
What's in Exhibit 1, your Exhibit 1, affects or deviate from attachment 2 that has been explained to us in your petition that cause these things not to happen?
So
These are the limits right here, attachment 2, by the district that says you must comply with these conditions for your petition.
correct.
Attachment 2.
Which conflict are you referring to? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Senator, can I help?
Attachment 2 from your initial petition.
Correct. Maybe I can provide some clarification.
Yeah, please do.
Okay. The number of starts, if we wanted to do those 4 starts on day 3, we would not be able to do so
Per attachment 2.
per attachment 2. Also, some of the starts that you see listed here, the runtime hours or the amount of time limit we're allowed for the start, we may not be able to comply with. And that's why we've asked for a variance from that. Or any one of these starts may have emissions that exceed the emissions that are limited that we showed in attachment 2.
See, what I'm seeking is explanation for the deviation from what's required to what's being requested. You understand that question?
Yeah, I do understand that.
Okay, fine. So was that explained in your initial statement?
Not well enough, obviously, so I'd be happy to.
Start again, please.
Yeah, okay. So the idea of commissioning itself, I probably haven't explained, and that is, if we were building this plant from the beginning, we would have a set of commissioning conditions that exempted us from every one of the conditions that are in the permit. But because we have modified that permit and built the plant, those commissioning conditions are no longer in our permit. So we're asking basically for a variance that looks similar to what we'd be doing if we were commissioning the plant again. And can I use the word commissioning to mean?
I understand.
Yeah, making it all work. And because there's engineers fine-tuning everything, oftentimes there are excess emissions associated with that activity till everything is tuned correctly. So we've identified that something could go wrong in every step causing excess emissions. We'll do everything in our power to minimize those, but the nature of commissioning means that during, for example, on day 3, those 4 starts, one start might be longer than is allowed, or one start there might be slightly more emissions than is allowed. We will complete all of the tuning and all of these tests such that by the end of commissioning, we'll be able to completely comply.
What's the end?
So we have identified 8 days, and if there's nothing goes wrong, we can be done in 8 days. But those 8 days may not be consecutive. Maybe something happens and we need a part. So we've asked for now until April 30th to perform this schedule, total number of hours not to exceed as if we did 8 days straight.
And this applies to unit 1, one turbine, unit 2, another turbine, and they're not being done simultaneously. So you get one is done 8 days, and the other one is done the next 8 days.
May I interrupt because, yes, I think you were about to.
I apologize.
Yeah, Mr. Richard should probably start answering for.
Yeah,
as
so
a
the way we
witness.
have our plan, that is correct, different days, but not in consecutive order. So it's going to be, day 1 might be unit 1, the next day, unit 2, while unit 1 takes a break. So they're going to kind of alternate steps because as they tune and as they find corrections to their tuning, it helps to have that knowledge firsthand to go to the second unit to help speed that tuning process up. So going back and forth as we go through the process, eventually they will be staggered day by day. Hopefully towards the end, we do have them running on the same day so we can then prove the full plant performance and the steam turbine performance.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yes.
Because now I am understanding that both unit 1, unit 2 must be operating simultaneously for the whole system to operate.
Eventually, that is the goal, correct? And we have to
So
prove.
therefore, you're going to.
Yes, we have to prove the plant's overall performance and ability, including the steam turbine has the same tuning requirements, but because the steam turbine is just taking steam from the gas turbines, it doesn't require a variance of this type. So, but the steam turbine does go through the same tuning process. We actually have 3 units which are being tuned in this same fashion.
Questions made, walk me through this to you earlier. So it seemed like to me, if you explain correctly,
Sure,
clearly, then we move on.
hope that helps.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Richards? Okay. Mr. Galati, if you can introduce, I guess, your third and final witness.
Yes, this is Gregory Darvin. And Mr. Darvin, could you please state your name, where you work, spell your name, and what your role is on the project?
My name is Gregory Darvin, air quality consultant for the applicant. Spelling of my name is Gregory, D-A-R, V as in Victor, I-N. Company name is Atmospheric Dynamics.
And Mr. Darvin, did you prepare the excess emission calculations that are shown on Exhibit 1, Table 1, Exhibit 1, Table 2?
Yes, I did.
Could you briefly describe how you calculated those emissions for purposes of the variance and that exhibit?
Sure. Siemens provided an operating schedule in terms of hours and fuel use and the expected number of startup and shutdowns for each day's events. So what I did basically was took their fuel use data, hours operations data, and took basically the emission factors that we have for both uncontrolled emissions, which in other words assumes that either the CO catalyst and or the SCR system is not functional or partially functional. And then when those units are actually operating in compliance, in other words, when the CO and SCR systems are fully functioning, then the emission calculations beginning on day 7 showed compliance with the back limits. But basically what was done was taking fuel use, multiplying it by the uncontrolled emission factors, then multiplying it by the hours of operation to come up with a day's total. Those were then summed for each of the individual days to produce the totals for the entire commissioning period.
And Mr. Darvin, do you believe that the variance conditions as they're proposed will ensure that the project's emissions don't exceed what you estimated?
Yes.
I have no further questions.
Thank you. Excuse me, Ms. Sunny Zavra, questions for the witness?
Maybe for clarification purposes, and maybe, I don't know if this is a good time to point it out. I just want to note, for the record, that the excess emissions calculations in the petition that you originally provided with do differ from the excess emissions calculations that are in this exhibit, and that was because we went through the process of recalculating it according to district policy. So I just want to make that distinction. So not an actual question yet.
Thank you. Board members, questions for Mr. Darvin? Ms. Byrd?
I'm thinking that I may have the wrong witness, but I'm going to ask this question, hoping that you might be able to respond. There was in Mr. McCormick's testimony, there was mention that the benefits of, there's additional benefits in replacing this equipment, reliance and safety, more responsive with emissions controls. Do you know if the new equipment will produce fewer emissions? Is it going to be, are the emissions going to be lower than they were before the old equipment was taken out?
I believe they'll probably be similar to what they are right now.
So that's not a benefit.
Well, typically, newer equipment does emit lower amounts, and obviously as equipment ages, you start bumping up against your back limits. So we find that out pretty much on all projects, but probably that's a better question for either Matt or
I missed my opportunity.
Kyle.
I'll have to go
But
back.
typically, experience, you have, when we typically permit these things, we base the emissions on potential. And then obviously we have SEMS and other monitoring equipment, and we always find that the actual is far less.
Okay.
And so over time, obviously, it creeps up, and then when you do a major overhaul, yeah, the numbers probably will drop down a little bit. I can't say by how much, but obviously the plant right now is meeting the current back limits, and we'll expect it to do so afterwards.
Okay.
So,
Okay, I would, if anybody else can answer that, we'll go back to you when we're done, if you don't mind.
Mr. Richards could answer that question for you.
Would you prefer to?
I can wait until, if anybody has any other questions.
Let's do that. Let's wait until there are questions for Mr. Darvin are answered, and then we can go back to Mr. Richards. Did you have any other questions for Mr. Darvin? Okay. I had questions. I just wanted to understand. So Table 2, that's total commissioning emissions. That's including what would otherwise be allowable? So those are those excess emissions, or is that total emissions?
She's looking at this.
right. I'm looking at the summary sheet here. Just real quick, just give me 1 second here.
Sure. Do you need to go off the record? We can do that too.
No, I think I can do this here for just a second. Those, the emissions in Table 2 are just the commissioning emissions. Those are not the commissioning emissions plus any additional runtime.
I guess my question is, so when we calculate excess emissions for a period of a variance, it's usually what is allowable during startup and shutdowns, et cetera, and what will.
Understood. Table 2 is just the total emissions. It's not the excess emissions. The excess emissions were actually calculated on attachment 5.
Okay, and although Ms. Sunny Zavra had explained that maybe they were different for a different reason, but.
Right, I may have, I think I misspoke. So the excess emissions that were calculated in attachment 5, which you have in the original petition that was submitted, are different from the excess emissions calculations that we calculated during the process of coming up with the proposed conditions. So we actually did amend that attachment number 5 to show the recalculation of excess emissions. I don't know that you have the amendment in front of you, but Mr. Galati may have. They have copies.
Do you have copies of that, Mr. Galati?
I do have copies. I would like to apologize ahead of time that I had to make them 11 by 17, and it's still very small print because it's a working Excel spreadsheet. It's, Mr. Darvin can walk you through that, but I do apologize ahead of
I was
time.
going to say, we'll take your apologies as long as Mr. Darvin can call it out for us so we can write it in bigger print.
I will do my best.
I didn't think it prudent to bring you all laptops so that you can do what I do, which is make it larger.
Hold on, let's see what we have.
Oh, this isn't bad. That's what, expecting worse.
Oh, this is huge. Oh, no, it's small. Okay, we've received a 2-page document, which I believe will be replacing attachment 5 to the petition. Is that correct? And we will mark it as Exhibit 2 for the petitioner. And then if you can have Mr. Darvin walk us through that.
Yeah, if I could lay a bit of a foundation. Mr. Darvin, the exhibit number 2 has 2 pages. What is the first page?
The first page is just a bit more detail on each commissioning activity.
And is that summarized in Table 1 on Exhibit 1?
Yes.
And the second page, can you tell us what that is?
Based on the schedule, this represents the emission calculation procedures that were used to quantify the total period emissions and the excess emissions during the commissioning process.
And the total commissioning emissions that's on Table 2 of Exhibit 1, was that taken directly from page 2 of Exhibit 2?
Yes, it was.
Could you please walk the board through how you came up with calculating the excess emissions?
Sure.
And then describe how you came up with the total commissioning emissions.
Sure. Actually, to calculate the excess emissions, we first have to quantify the total commissioning emissions during the month period. And then from that, we subtract out the allowed emissions from that total number to then come up with the excess emissions. So the excess emissions, and I apologize for the colors and the print, but in orange, if you notice over on the left-hand side, total excess emissions, 2 turbines, all events in pounds. For VOCs, NOx, and CO, for instance, the VOC, the number is 170.1. That represents the excess emissions during the commissioning period that was calculated. Likewise, for NOx, it's 1,676.3 pounds for both turbines combined. CO, 3,251.5 pounds. During the process of commissioning, we're not expecting PM10 or SO2 to have any excess emissions, since those emissions are typically based on fuel use, and the fuel use during most of the commissioning activities is quite a bit less than the full load fuel use numbers.
Thank you. Just to clarify on the record and be very clear, so these are combined for both turbines?
Yes.
Okay. Would you be able to just, I know, let me step back. The turbines will continue to be down during the month while they're being commissioned, except for commissioning activities, is that correct?
Yes, although at the end of the commissioning period, I believe if there's emissions available that are left, then, and Matt might be a better person to answer this question, but I believe they will then want to start the plant up again as soon as possible. So if there's days left in the month and there are emissions left, then they'll start operation.
Meaning if there's, under the agreed-upon conditions of the variance, if there's any time and,
Right.
well, essentially time, because it's not limited in,
Well, there is a monthly limit on emissions that we compared it to. If you take a look at the yellow-green box, again, I apologize about the colors. The PTO limits monthly, that represents the monthly limits that the plant can operate in terms of total emissions. So for instance, PM10 is 4,876 pounds, VOCs 3,236 pounds, et cetera. If you look just above it in yellow for the 2-turbine case, that represents the total commissioning emissions. And in each one of those cases, the commissioning emissions are far less than the monthly limits.
That was going to be my question. Thank you very much.
I knew that was coming.
Okay. Okay, any other questions for Mr. Darvin? Okay, I think that there was a question that Ms. Byrd had that Mr. Richards would be able to answer, or did I have that right?
Yes. Ms. Byrd, can I rephrase the question to make sure we understand it? I think your question had to do with Mr. McCormick had a statement that there was a corresponding emission benefit to upgrading this control system. And so I'd like Mr. Richards to address that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So the unit essentially, the control system is a pretty advanced piece of hardware that controls both the gas turbine loads and the corresponding emissions response. Of course, we're required to adhere to these emission limits, and we use the control system to do that. The new system should provide faster response to gas turbine emissions changes, and those changes stem from load changes, typically as often as 5-minute intervals dictated by the ISO grid. So if the grid calls on the unit to do a sudden load change up or down, the emissions off of the turbine then suddenly change in corresponding to those load changes. In response to that, the emission system has to then respond by injecting ammonia to reduce our NOx emissions. The new system will improve the speed and accuracy and reliability of that particular system, which will help us better achieve our NOx limits during these load changes without operator intervention. The old system required at times significant operator manual intervention to jump in and help it. Bring those levels within compliance for our hourly averages, which we have no problem doing, but the new system will do that in a much more efficient manner.
But we all know numbers. No, you're saying, I expected it's going to be more efficient, I guess.
Yeah.
And I just thought that maybe, I like to know.
I don't have
numbers.
specific numbers exactly, as
Okay.
far as details, but typically if we have a load change, it may take, up to 2 minutes for our system to restabilize currently, sometimes 3 or 4 if it's a significant load change, where the new system should be able to restabilize that within probably less than a minute, hopefully. It's a much more proactive system, which looks at more variables than the current system does.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Richards? Wonderful. So, and those are all of your witnesses, is that correct?
I'd like to bring Mr. McCormick back one time and address an issue that
Yes, yes, you may do that. And Senator, did you?
I
have a
don't know who
question?
could best answer this question, but I think it's appropriate to ask it this time. When you interface with the system of operation, so if your system is malfunction and not ready to be with the independent system operator, is there anything to prevent it from happening? A safety measure?
To prevent a malfunction?
Yeah, prevent your system from interfacing or merging with the independent system operator system, thereby it would cause a shutdown. Any safety measures there?
Am I understand the question? It's in regards to the protection of the units, or in regards to?
Protecting the ISO.
Yeah, so the testing I spoke of that does protect both the ISO and the plant operations from malfunctions like you're referring to. Am I not understanding the question?
So therefore, you are precluded from interfacing with the ISO if your system is not functioning properly to merge or to be accepted. The guy saying yeah in the back, maybe you don't understand the question.
Yeah, I'm not quite understanding the question. If you could clarify,
He
Scott,
does
if
in
you
the back.
understand.
could I restate it in energy lingo?
Be my guess.
Okay.
That helps me
Thank
out.
you. I think what the senator is asking is, are there, if you don't upgrade this system, or if this system malfunctions, you're prevented from interconnecting with the grid and delivering electricity per Cal ISO requirements?
We are not currently prevented if this upgrade did not take place now, but we have had increased instances of instability and outages of the control system caused by the current control system, which then preclude the plant from operating.
If you were operating and you had some sort of malfunction, are there systems in place to ensure that the facility either shuts down or curtails and doesn't damage the grid?
Yes.
Does this control system interact with those systems?
This new system replaces many of those safety systems. with upgraded safety systems.
Dr. Lerner has a question as well.
You did well.
A follow-up question. You have a month in which to do this. Actually, not a month, because this is the 5th of April, and you want to be done by the end of April. What happens if something goes kerflooey between now, let's say on the second to last day, you're ready to go, and something falls apart? It's like dropping a dozen eggs. What, do you have a way of backing that up, or are you going to tell us that you need more time? How would you go about dealing with this kind of emergency? Thank you.
Well, yes, we never hope that happens, but there's always a plan in place for that. If that were to happen and we were close to the end of this variance permit, we'd have to, again, reapply for another emergency variance or that pertains to that particular unit. If we couldn't complete one of the gas turbines, that would be what would have to happen. We would not just resume testing without the variance in place.
So you're telling me that this assumes, the outline of this assumes that everything is going to go smoothly, you're not going to have a problem, and you're going to be done at the end of the month? Or by the end of the month, or before the end of the month? I'm concerned because sometimes people come before us and ask for a variance that includes a little wiggle room. Now, I realize you have a shutdown, so this is a beautiful time to do it. I mean, beautiful is not the word, but you know what I mean. It's an appropriate time. You can make hay while the sun shines, so to speak. But what happens if it gets cloudy and rainy? Can you make hay then?
Yeah, if that were to happen, we would have to go through this process with the unit that was affected by that. But we have a good plan in place. We have a great, we've proven mechanical systems mechanically are sound, which is typically the 9 times out of 10 the issue that precludes you from performing these tests. But if the commissioning were to be interrupted by a significant casualty of some sort, then we would have to re-enter the commissioning phase once that repair took place. And if it was significant, it would likely be weeks or possibly after this deadline. So we would have to re-engage at that point. But this is our best plan now, that with the knowledge that we have with our best team making these plans. So.
Last question. Do you have some spare days before the end of the month so that if something does happen, you will be able to repair it in time? In other words, is there something built in? I think that was really my original question.
Okay, I understand. So we have until the 30th, as we had proposed for this variance, and as in the conditions outlined, we have 8 days per unit. So we're hoping to have those 8 days needed per unit, 16 days, even though we have 30. So that does allow us time, like you said, if we have off days. If we have a mechanical breakdown, if we have issues that need to be shut down for 4 or 5 days, we can then resume commissioning activities and still meet the 30th deadline. I hope that clarifies that.
That was my question. Okay. I'm sorry I rephrased it poorly.
No, that
Thank
works.
you.
Yep.
I understand you wanted to recall Mr. McCormack. I just wanted to let everyone know the timeframe that we're working with on this case. I would normally have taken a break by this point, but we had to start at 9:30. We are going to have to break at 11:30 until 12:45 if we do not complete this matter by that time for similar reasons. And so just to let you know, that's what we're working with. So I'm going to try not to take a break unless anyone really needs one. And we'll see how far we get by 11:30. But 11:30, and we must stop until 12:45 at that time.
Thank you. My question will be 5 seconds. His answer will be less than 1 minute. I just wanted to correct something.
You should present your full case. That was just to let everyone know the time frame we're working in.
Thank you very much. Mr. McCormack, I'm sorry I forgot to ask you something in our effort to be transparent. In our petition for our variance, we identified that there was an outstanding notice of violation. Could you please describe that notice of violation so that the board knows what may be going on there?
I sure can. We do have a single outstanding notice violation currently. What it stems back to and relates to is a reporting error. We had an administrative error in submitting a report on time by a 30th deadline, I believe. We did discover the error ourselves, corrected it ourselves, resubmitted the report, and self-reported our mistake. It did result in a notice of violation, but we wanted to make sure that we were transparent and clear on that.
That's all I brought Mr. McCormick back from.
Thank you. Ms. Sunny Zafra, any questions on that?
We don't have any follow-up questions on that. Thank you.
And I saw that notice of violation, was that in 2016?
That's correct, yes.
And were there any issues since then of any reporting?
No, nothing.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions on that? Thank you. Does that complete your affirmative case?
Yes, it does.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Sunny Zafra, did you plan to put on any witnesses?
I don't plan to put on any affirmative witnesses, but I do have with me Nidya Barra, Vicky Lee, and Bhaskar Chandan, who all worked on the proposed conditions and also helped with the excess emissions calculations in case the board has any questions for them.
Does anyone have any questions and would like to have a district witness provide answers to any questions you may have? Seeing none, thank you very much, Ms. Sunny Zafra, for that opportunity. And to the witnesses, thank you all for being here. Okay, I think at this time I'm going to ask if there's any member of the public who wishes to be heard on this matter. And I see none. Sorry, Mr. Galati, if you'd like to give us your closing, just a brief summary of what we've heard, that would be great.
Yes, I thank you very much, Madam Chair and members of the board, for listening and participating in this hearing, asking us questions. We think that we have made the appropriate showing in testimony that you can make the 6 findings. I'm not going to go through those again here. I think you've heard the testimony. We would ask that you vote and approve this variance through the end of April. And knowing that we have conservatively overestimated the excess emissions and we have contingency built in to do our very best to not come back before you.
Thank you very much. Usually I pull that before I turn it on. Ms. Sunny Zafra, your closing.
So based on the evidence and the testimony presented here today, the district does not oppose the granting of the short variance, but I have one quick housekeeping matter. Again, in the petition that was submitted, question number 9, which lists all the rules that petitioner wants a variance from. The third box down says permit condition A99.5 and Rule 2005. We believe that should be Rule 1303A1, but maybe petitioner can jump in and clarify if that's incorrect.
I'm going to defer to the district council on that.
So we're going to say that's 1303A1, which is the requirements for backed, and so cross out Rule 2005. And that's all.
Thank you. And if we can just take one moment so I could just review those rules, not having noticed them under the permit condition, and then we'll just take 2 minutes off the record. Did you need more time, board members? Anyone?
I just have one question, I may not need anything. Okay,
Do you have a question for?
the district. Yes, so the third box down is 1303A1, and I'm sorry if you can just, I noticed that the second box was also 1303A1. So you're saying the first box, Rule 2005 applies?
May I, before we even go through that, we've had petitioners request variances from these rules before, in particular 1303A1. I don't believe it is appropriate because those back rules and requirements are directed at the executive officer and not at any one petitioner. Ms. Honeyzava?
Okay. If I can have 1 second.
For example, 1303A1, with regard to backed, states the executive officer or designee shall deny the permit to construct for any relocation or for any new or modified source which results in an emissions increase of any non-attainment, air contaminant, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
So
Maybe
it's not some,
3002
go ahead.
instead of 1303, which would be directed at us, Rule 3002, since they're a reclaimed facility and it's a
I see.
modification.
So it should be, they're also Title V, correct? So it should be 203B, 3002C1,
C1, yes.
and 2004F1.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry, did you say three, which one did you say that you felt applied? Didn't you say 1302?
1303 initially, but,
It does not
but
apply.
that doesn't apply here.
Okay, but did you mention another one? I'm sorry, I'm looking and reading and,
2005
No.
does not apply either. We're just, what we're talking about is the regular rules that are not listed on item 9, but that would generally apply when you have permit conditions that are not complied with.
I was trying to read
And I
it.
apologize to the board. What I did was I actually quoted the rule that allowed the district to issue those permit conditions. And instead of the general permitting rules, I apologize.
That's okay, you're not the first to do that, but we just have to be
I
clear.
won't do it again.
We have to be clear, the variance cannot be granted from that. Okay, board members, with all of that, would anyone like to begin discussions or deliberations today on this matter?
I will if you like.
Ms. Bird, yes.
Okay, okay, I think that from my reading and my understanding of the testimony today, that this is a good time for this facility to request a variance, and it's a short variance, and they expect to be done by the end of the month. I believe we can make the findings, and I'm going to turn over my notes real fast. In this case, we have a facility that wants to use the opportunity that they will be down anyway to upgrade equipment, and that sounds like a very prudent thing to do. I think that we can make the first finding because they will be in violation. Even though they're shut down, they're required to have this equipment. Let's see. They're required to have their equipment to operate. So they're operating outside of their permit, basically. That's what it would be. And in this case, they're operating outside of their permit to make some changes that need to be made to upgrade their equipment while they are shut down. So they're in violation of those rules that have to do with operating outside of the permit, in that they need to test equipment to make sure that it will be in line with Cal ISO when they reconnect. So they will be out of compliance for that. This is beyond reasonable control. Equipment ages, and they're taking this opportunity to replace equipment while they're down that is aging, that has become obsolete, and that is difficult to repair and find parts for. So I believe that we can find that's beyond their reasonable control, and to not allow them to do this and to eventually fall into disrepair, I think would be an arbitrary or unreasonable taking. Also, we've heard that if they cannot upgrade their equipment eventually, they may have to close the facility. The closing or taking would be without a corresponding benefit in reducing air contaminants. I believe that for the numbers that we've seen for air contaminants, even though there will be some exceedances of concentrations, the mass emissions will be less than if they actually were operating during this time. So I do believe that it would be without a corresponding benefit in reducing air contaminants. They have, number 4 is that they've given consideration to curtailment. Actually, there's not much to curtail when you're not operating. So they're not operating, and they're utilizing this time to now put in place this new equipment. They're reducing emissions, and testimony was that they spoke with Siemens, the company that was in charge of conducting this test or providing this equipment, and they have changed the schedule to run some things simultaneously so that they can reduce the number of days that they would actually be emitting. So I believe that they are making an effort to reduce excess emissions to the maximum extent feasible. And then while the variance is in effect, they will be quantifying emissions. And I apologize because I haven't finished reading through all of the every single line of the conditions that have been offered, but they will be monitoring emissions. Condition number 12 says they're recording fuel usage, and these records will be made available to the district. So they will be monitoring emissions, and they will be reporting to the district whenever there are any complaints or opacity exceedances and what have you. So and for that reason, or those reasons, I do think that we can make the findings and issue this short variance. I just want to add one thing. The benefit too of this equipment is that it will be more reliable and has a safety element, more responsive to emissions controls. And even though we weren't able to get a number of how much better that would operate, we know that if it's more responsive and takes less time to ramp up, that will reduce emissions as well. So for those reasons, I think I can make the findings.
Mr. Camarena, you had something to add?
Yes, perhaps I didn't hear it, Ms. Byrd. I might have missed it while I was looking at my notes. With respect to finding number 4, did you address that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, curtailment is not an option, I guess is what I'm saying. Curtailment's not an option. They're already not operating because they're down for maintenance, and there's no way to curtail the need to have to run the equipment for testing, so.
Right, I think, and the particular finding is that it would obviate the need for, in lieu of a variance, and in this case, the very purpose or need for the variance is to actually operate. So curtailment is not going to, that finding can easily be made. It would not obviate the need for a variance in this situation. It's creating the need. And I just wanted to add, I agree with all the findings. I do believe it's beyond their reasonable control. There was testimony, and in the petition, we see that this is quite obsolete, and it only will get worse. And so they're in the situation where, in order to comply with Cal ISO and be reliable, they need to upgrade this equipment as control equipment. In addition, I wanted to put an exclamation point on the finding that the closing or taking of not granting the ability to commission this control equipment would be without a corresponding benefit in reducing air contaminants. And I know you mentioned this, Ms. Byrd, but looking at Exhibit 2 in the second page, where there's the comparison between the excess emissions, which, if you were to look at them, might seem like they're considerable, but they're considerably lower than what is allowable under the permit were they operating this month. So I think a lot of respect should be given to the fact that this particular petitioner considered timing to make sure that they're really in reality not, there are no real excess emissions, even though they're above what would be allowed by the rules in terms of startups and shutdowns. And then just to be a little more clear that for the record, virtually every section of condition A 99.3.4 and .5 would require a variance, and that's shown very well on attachment 2, which was gone over in fine detail during the testimony in terms of the number of startups, the duration of startups, the amount of excess emissions. So, and there was also, to sum it all up, there was also testimony that that's very conservative and not expected. So with all that, I can make the findings as well. Anyone else wish to further deliberate? Senator.
The turbines are essential for operation, provide electricity for city of Vernon to meet their electrical needs. They're high efficiency, low emission electrical support for the region. The upgrading of the control software will increase the reliability of the critical electrical generating resources and is necessary to meet the grid reliability and safety and mandated by the California Independent System Operation. So that's makes it a perfect system, essentially, hopefully. My only one concern is that if it's not ready to merge or integrate with the ISO because of some human error, intentionally, can you believe that? It could happen. And it lost the whole system up. There's no trigger mechanism to shut it down if it's not functioning properly before it integrates with the ISO. That you got to learn. I think that's something to be considered. But anyway, other than that, it should work well with the variance, and you meet those goals and objectives for the emission levels. Fine, I'll vote for it.
Thank you. And I wanted to address, Dr. Lerner had some concerns about what if it goes over, what if you're not complete, and would they have to come back? And I just wanted to say, I think it's a well-constructed variance that we limit the amount of hours and the time as much as possible. And if something were to happen, to require the facility to come back and have to explain why they went over, rather than giving too much leeway and giving too broad of a variance when it might not be required. So in deliberating, I think that's actually a good thing. Anyone else have any thoughts?
I don't have any other thoughts, but I'd like to take like a couple more minutes to read through the conditions.
I think that would be a great idea.
Really quick. Okay.
Let's take 5 minutes to make sure that we have fully reviewed the proposed variance conditions before any motion is made. So we'll go off the record for about 5 minutes. We are back on the record. We've now had an opportunity to review the variance conditions. I just wanted to note for the record that there needs to be 2 changes made to condition number 13, I believe, which states petitioner shall not exceed the total emissions as delineated in petitioner's, it says amended attachment 5, so that would be exhibit 2. And in attached, it says table 2, but that would be exhibit 1, table 2, I assume. So just to make those 2 changes. Ms. Honey-Zavra?
I might have raised my hand preemptive. Oh, in condition number 6, we also mention amended attachment 5. So in number 6, we can change that to petitioner's exhibit 2.
And then also where we mentioned table 1, that's exhibit 1.
Okay, so just to be clear on the record, so then condition number 6 would then read as delineated in petitioner's exhibit number 1, no, exhibit 2. And where it goes on to say, also summarized in exhibit 1, table 1. Okay, and any other than adding, which the motion maker will do, adding a date in condition 22, I think those are all the changes unless anyone else saw anything that, okay, and with that said, would anyone like to offer a motion? Ms. Byrd?
In the matter of Bicent California Malberg LLC, case number 5727-4, for the facility located at 5963 Soto Street in Vernon, California, I move that we issue this short variance commencing immediately and running through April 30th, 2018 for the equipment located on page 2, unit 1 and 2, combustion turbines, for the permit conditions.
Page 2 of the petition.
Page 2 of the petition, I'm sorry. Page 2 of the petition for the conditions, permit conditions listed on page 9 from Rules 203B, 2004 F1, 3002 C1 as it relates to those permit conditions. And with the excess emissions expected to be as per exhibit 2 for the 2 turbines, for the VOCs, I'm sorry, yeah, for both turbines it'll be 254.4 pounds for the period. For, you know, that yellow has just a little bit of a flash to it.
I believe you are reading from the wrong, it should be the orange total excess emissions. So it should be, there should be 3 numbers, one for VOC, one for NOx, and one for CO.
Okay, but there are 2 turbines and sometimes they run simultaneously?
Should be the 2.
Okay. Oh, okay, okay. Okay. For 170, okay, 170.1 VOCs, NOx of 1,676.3, and CO of 3,251.5 pounds for the period. And it will be with the conditions as listed in Exhibit A, with the changes that had been noted earlier in number 6, where we took out amended attachment 5 and replaced that with Exhibit 2, and inserted Exhibit 1 in front of Table 1. And then on number 13, the same thing, take out amended attachment 5, insert Exhibit 2, and Exhibit 1, insert Exhibit 1 before Table 2. I think that's, and those are all the changes.
I think we need a date in condition 22.
Yes. 15 days ago, what did you say? Oh. I thought you were making a joke. Okay, so today is so it's April 20th, 2018. That completes my motion.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Thank you, Mr. Camarena. Okay, there was something I wanted to say, and now I'm remembering. I have nothing to amend on the motion or to suggest amendment to the motion, but I did want to point out in discussion on the motion that I neglected to mention that the petitioner also, by condition number 17, while not minimizing excess emissions, has agreed to offset excess NOx emissions with the purchase of RTC trading credits. Any other discussion on the motion? Seeing, Senator?
My only concern, I think you know what I mean, is not idiot-proof. It is not idiot-proof. In terms of someone tampering with the system, that could cause an outage in the ISO.
I would be happy to talk to you outside the record about.
I know, yeah,
Okay,
you know what I
about
mean.
this. Okay,
You
thanks.
do understand?
Although
I do.
that would be an ex parte communication we should not have. I appreciating the senator's concern, and just noting for the record that for the variance that is requested, it is not relevant to that, but I understanding relevant, just putting it on the record. Any other discussion on the motion, board members? Senator, how do you vote?
What's the question?
How do you vote?
Aye.
Dr. Lerner, how do you vote?
Yes.
I vote yes, and
Yes.
Mr. Camarena.
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0. Thank you very much and good luck.
5 minutes to spare.
And look, 5 minutes to spare.
Thank you very much. I think you're a very attentive board. I don't do much work in front of South Coast, but I do in other districts. I really appreciate the questions and the interaction. I would also like to make sure that you board members know how brilliant your staff has been. They've been very helpful with us working after hours in the evening to get to you those conditions, and we just wanted to make sure that that is on the record. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to let you know, we are independent of the district, and district staff is independent of us. However, we also note how diligent they are and competent as well. So thank you very much. And any other business, board members? With that, we are adjourned for the day. Thank you very much.